Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us here at Brookings for our event on U.S. immigration policy, separating fact from fiction. It's a pleasure to welcome you. I want you to know that we are very interested in having you participate in this conversation. And so in order to do that, please submit questions as we go along via X, which is obviously formerly Twitter, at Brookings.gov with the hashtag immigration policy, or you can email us at events@brookings.edu. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce our fantastic panel. I am Camille Busette. I'm the Interim Vice President and Director of Governance Studies here at Brookings. I'm joined by Doris Meissner, the Senior Fellow at the Migration Policy Institute and former Commissioner of U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, Elaine Kamarck, Founding Director for the Center for Effective Public Management and Senior Fellow here in Brookings of Governance Studies, and Bill Galston, Ezra A. Zulka Chair and Senior Fellow Governance Studies. So thank you all for joining us. I wanted to start by setting the groundwork with some facts. And so for that, I'm going to turn to Doris. Doris, I want you to describe to our audience what are the legal and illegal ways for foreign nationals to enter the U.S. at our southern border? And that's the first question. And the second is, we all know that President Biden recently changed the policy approach to requesting asylum. And we want to know what those changes were and whether they're having an impact on the flow of foreign nationals arriving at the southern border. So first, maybe just tell us, how do people arrive? How do they enter the U.S. at our southern border, illegally and legally? And please don't forget to unmute yourself.
Good morning. Thank you very, very much. I'm pleased to be here. So in talking about the southwest border and, as you say, putting some of the facts out there, let me just start with very quickly saying that our U.S.-Mexico border is a 2,000-mile-long border. And it is a border that is extremely different in its geography and in the way in which people come and go. It is an area that has very dense populations and cities on both sides of the border that are connected to each other and are very urban. And it also has extremely rural, remote areas, many of them extremely dangerous, deserts, mountains, etc., from a weather and topography standpoint. So what goes on at the southwest border in terms of immigration and migration is typically referred to as entries that come through ports of entry, POEs, ports of entry, or between ports of entry. And so ports of entry are the places where cars and trade and people cross: San Diego, El Paso, McAllen, Texas, Nogales, Arizona, those kinds of places that we're all familiar with. And those crossings are largely legal crossings. There are sometimes people and contraband that come through in cars, etc., but they handle enormous amounts of trade and traffic of people. And those people come with visas or border crossing cards or temporary visas, and they come by the thousands. I mean, the San Diego crossing area is the busiest every single day land border crossing in the world. So there's a tremendous amount of legal movement back and forth. But of course, what the controversy is about and the issues are have to do with the between ports of entry, where people try to come into the country that don't have authorization to come through those ports of entry. And that's a picture that has been quite stable for a long time, but then has changed quite quickly in recent years. The stable for a long time has been the crossings illegally between the ports of entry, almost entirely by young Mexican males, beginning in the 1970s through about the mid-teens, through about the mid-2000 teens. And those young Mexican males were single. They were looking for work in the United States. They were trying to avoid the Border Patrol, and that constituted about 98% of the crossings and of the apprehensions at the southwest border. That began to change starting really in about 2012, but really began to be quite apparent by about 2014, 2015, when that flow began to change to much more heavily Central American countries. And those were Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. And that change then, just a few years later, coming into 2020, 2021, began to be eclipsed by crossings from even further south than Central America. And that change in the flows has been enormously consequential, because what has happened is those, first of all, the fact of diverse nationalities has simply been different from the standpoint of what Border Patrol needs to do in processing people. But it's also the case that those people were really fleeing mixed conditions, both poverty and the typical economic migrant profile that we had seen for really 40 years with the Mexican flow, but also increasingly people that were fleeing violence, cartels, repressive governments, and the beginnings of climate changes, huge, tremendous storms that washed out, whole hillsides, villages, agricultural occupations, etc. So that change meant that people were not trying to avoid the Border Patrol, they were trying to find the Border Patrol. And in finding the Border Patrol, they wanted to be able to connect with a US official in order to file a claim for asylum in the United States. And that change of people that became and are now asylum seekers has been a dramatic change, because those people all have the right to have their asylum claim heard. And asylum claims are heard by immigration judges, and they require some time to decide and to determine the facts and the issues in the case. And the numbers that were beginning to come led to the increase in the asylum workload that was massive. An asylum workload that basically had been pretty much under control until about the mid-teens, absolutely exploded. And as a result, people who are claiming asylum are in case backlogs that mean that their case will not be heard for many years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. And by the time their case is heard, first of all, the facts tend to have become outdated to an extent, but more importantly, depending on the country from which the people came, the large share tend to be denied, because by and large, these are cases of people who certainly are fleeing dangers. They certainly are people that have compelling stories, but those are not necessarily circumstances that meet the definition for asylum. The definition for asylum is one that is in our statute, says the definition of a refugee, and that is a high standard to meet. So when those cases are heard, and it does depend on the nationalities, I mean, people coming from countries like, I don't know, Cameroon or Myanmar or so, where there are clear refugee circumstances will get approved at high percentages. But people from other countries, particularly in this hemisphere, are not likely to be approved. And so if they are not approved, by the time they've been here for many years, it's very, very difficult for them to be repatriated. And so what we find is, I mean, the data are very clear on this. If people come and have a decision and are found to be not eligible within a year, you can probably still successfully remove people to their home country. But longer than a year, it basically does not happen. People have sunk down roots, they have gotten jobs, some of them have had children in the United States, which therefore means they have US citizen children because they're born here. And so this has created a cycle of of reinforcing the reasons to try to come to the United States and claim asylum. Now, the Biden administration has tried to a whole series of things to manage the border effectively. And the whole series of things that it has tried are based on the proposition that we want to be a nation of immigrants, that we want to be able to be providing humanitarian protection, in other words, the right to claim asylum, but that there should be an orderly way of doing it. And so the Biden administration's policies have been to try to establish ways that encourage people to come in an orderly way, but more and more discourage these between ports of entry admissions that often have resulted in incredible amounts of chaos and hardship and increasing numbers. So some of the things that the Biden administration has done, you've heard about and people have read about. One of them is this app called the CBP-1 app, which allows for a daily average of people to apply in advance to come to the United States through a port of entry. And we now, as a country, bring in 1,450 people a day through that CBP-1 app, which people apply for. The Biden administration has set up some special programs called the CHNB. It's Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, Venezuelan. Those are countries to which we have either don't have diplomatic relations, or in the case of Haiti, it is in such a terrible state that we simply will not return people to that country. And the CHNV program allows people to apply for abroad to come into the United States legally at a level of 30,000 a month. So that is a very large number. The administration has also put a real innovation into place, which is called Safe Mobility Offices. It's attempting to build a network of offices throughout the Western Hemisphere where people can go closer to home and not take those dangerous journeys to come to the US and be screened for refugee admission to the United States. There are other things that the administration has attempted to do in terms of working with other countries. But they all sit on very fragile footings because they are all based on executive branch authority, particularly something called the use of parole, which we can talk about further. And they all also really are they are ultimately still increasing this asylum workload in the United States because people have to, even through these special programs, have to have an adjudication of their asylum claim. And that asylum caseload tends to continue to be a pull factor because for all of the difficulties involved in getting to the border, if you do get to the border, even through one of these special programs, you're going to be in a case backlog for years. So let me stop there. There are lots of issues embedded in what I've said that I'm happy to follow up on.
Well, thank you, Doris. Obviously very, very complex, but I think it's very helpful for people to understand not only the history of the changes, but also what's been done recently to try to alter the flow of asylum seekers. I think we're going to go on and talk about what's happening or what's been happening in Congress. Elaine, I'm going to turn to you. Obviously, Congress is in the driver's seat when it comes to making meaningful policy changes on immigration. Doris has alluded to this already. And as we all know, earlier this year, the Senate, House, and the Biden administration negotiated an immigration policy reform. That effort was ultimately scuttled by former President Donald Trump. But what I think it's helpful for people to understand, since that bill was probably one of the first major pieces of immigration policy legislation in a really long time, to understand what was actually in that bill. You are on mute, so if you can unmute yourself, that would be wonderful.
There we go. No matter how long we do Zooms, we always forget that. Okay, the Immigration Visa Efficiency and Security Act of 2023 was really truly a bipartisan act. It was signed on to by some of the most conservative members of the United States Senate. And it was really, as you'll see as I go through this, you see it's got a little bit something for everything in there. Um, and there's sort of it's sort of in two segments. One segment deals with basic authorities of the border and of DHS. And the second deals with the personnel problems and a scaling up issue. So the first one that got a lot of attention is basically Border Emergency Authority, which for shorthand people call Trigger Authority. And that would enable an administration to summarily deport migrants who enter between ports of entry. Remember Doris's distinction there, without permitting them to apply for asylum. And this would be activated if border encounters reach a daily average of 4,000 people over a period of 7 days. It would become mandatory if that went to 50,000 over a period of 7 days, or 8,500 over a single day. Now, there's a lot of other rules. This doesn't close the border completely, but there's a lot of other routes that give some exceptions. Like, for instance, it doesn't apply to non-Mexican minors, but basically it's a strong authority. The bill also raises the standard for being able to claim asylum, as decided at the initial screening interview stage, when an asylum officer determines whether or not an individual can progress to making an asylum claim. And maybe later on we might want to, because I'd love to hear Doris talk about the intricacies of the asylum claim. But to finish up the pieces of the bill, it also contains a streamlined process for Afghan evacuees who have not obtained asylum, and because these are generally people who cooperated with U.S. troops in Afghanistan, translators, etc. And it would give a 13% increase in employment-based visas and a 7% increase for family-based visas for the next 5 years. So right there, you can see that these things you can see what a compromise bill this is. The second piece of the bill, or general, deals with, and Doris talked about this enormous new problem that the government encountered beginning in the teens, of just massive numbers of people coming, not just for the usual reasons of political persecution, etc., but for things like environmental impacts on coffee crops. I mean, I suspect people don't know that the coffee crops in some of these Central American countries were devastated, causing lots of bankruptcies, lots of unemployment, lots of depression, etc. So you have a lot of things that are sort of outside the control of the U.S. In terms of having people come more often. So you've got now a problem with just capacity. The border is overwhelmed. The bipartisan bill would add 1,500 new Customs and Border Protection Patrol. And Border Patrol staffing has remained roughly flat over the past few years, despite the fact that border encounters have increased by 250% over the same period. Today, there are just shy of 25,000 Border Patrol agents. 1,500 new Customs and Border Patrol sounds a little measly in that context. However, one of the things, and I'm sure Doris can talk about this in more depth than I can, it is really hard to hire people to work at the border. First of all, you need security clearances. And remember that ever since 9/11, the United States government has been overwhelmed with needing to issue more and more new security clearances, and we're very slow at it. It's a slow process, and we're not very good at doing it. And there have been various efforts to try to speed it up. But obviously, you need a security clearance for people working at the border. Terrorists and drug lords would absolutely love to have their folks at the border. So that slows down hiring, as does the fact that many of these places along the border are not places Americans want to go live in. as Doris mentioned, in between these ports of entry, it's rough land, it's harsh countryside. People are going to be loath to bring their kids there, and if you're a law enforcement type who would do this kind of work, there's many other options in the federal government besides the Mexican border. Secondly, the bill provides for an increase in asylum officer staffing. Today, there's about 1,000 asylum officers. The bipartisan bill would add an additional 4,300 asylum officers, hopefully to make the process faster and fairer. Beds for detention beds, right now we've got about 41,000. The bill would increase that number to 50,000. And immigration judges, this has been a problem for a long time. Currently, excuse me, currently each immigration case is taking 5 to 7 years to complete. And there are 734 immigration judges. The bill would provide funding for an additional 100 immigration judges and their associated staff. Also in the bill are machines to help catch fentanyl, cutting-edge machines. And also in the bill is $1.4 billion for cities and states dealing with an influx of migrants and provision to expedite work permits for those currently in the country who qualify. So as you can see, there's tough stuff in here. There's what you would call more liberal stuff, like the aid to cities and states, and permitting of expediting of work permits, that sort of thing. And you can see this is very much a compromise bill, which was not, in fact, did not in fact go forward because Donald Trump stopped it. So that's what's in the bill. It does address many of the things that Doris pointed out, but even, let me just put on my old reinventing government hat, even if you pass this bill, the implementation is very, very difficult and very, very slow. So I just want to put that in.
Great. Thanks very much, Elaine, for that background. Bill, turning to you. So obviously, one of the reasons we're holding this event is that immigration is currently one of the most salient issues for voters during this election. I want to just get your take on why this is the case, and maybe tell us a little bit more about whether the concern for immigration is universally held by all voters, or whether there are particular voters who are more concerned about this issue than others.
Well, the white-hot debate about immigration that we're having now feels new. It's anything but. You know, we have prided ourselves from our creation as being a nation of immigrants. We've also, from our creation as a nation, been a country that has struggled with immigration. And the history of immigration illustrates that point. Probably the first big event was the surge of immigrants from Ireland in the 1840s, during and right after the notorious potato famine that made it impossible for families to survive. So a huge percentage of the Irish population came here, and they brought with them not only distinctive cultural habits, but also their religion, Catholicism, which in a predominantly Protestant country was felt to be a real threat to democracy. Then after the Civil War, there was a surge of immigrants from new places, not mainly Northern Europe, but Southern Europe and Central Europe. There were Slavs, Italians, and Jews. They brought with them new languages, new habits. In the case of Jews, a religion that had not previously been dense on the ground in the United States. This generated over time a very large backlash as the share of non-native born Americans surged to 15% of the total population by the early 1920s. And there was, an increase in nativist literature, on so-called scientific racial theories purporting to show that these were inferior breeds of human beings that were being let into the country, that were diluting the purity, of the white Anglo-Saxon race, as it was then called. And as a result, the gates of immigration in the United States were essentially slammed shut in 1924 and were not really substantially reopened until 41 years later in 1965. And during that 41-year period, the share of immigrants, as a percentage of the population, fell by 2/3, from 15% to 5%. And it was a period of cultural integration of the previous waves of immigrants, the famous MGM foxholes with, Hungarian and an Italian and a boy from the South and, a Jewish boy from the Bronx. That was a massive process of social and cultural integration. And then after 1965, that process turned around. It was sort of like a slow motion process that led to a reversal of the decline in immigrants as a share of the population. And so today, we're basically back up to where we were in the early 1920s. And just as in the 1920s, there has been a huge backlash. Part of it is demographic, part of it is economic, and part of it is cultural. And if you look at the controversy that has erupted in and about Springfield, Ohio, it's a perfect illustration of that trifecta of complaints against immigrants, despite the fact that most of the immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, are there legally. They're there to work. They have become a very important part of the workforce in that city. And complaints about immigration were really at a pretty low level, although there were a handful of incidents, as you might imagine. But we are in one of those periods now where the increased share of immigrants from all sources, plus the surge of unauthorized immigration at the southern border that has occurred really in just the past few years, has created an explosive political situation around the issue, not for the first time, and probably not for the last. This is a story that we're going through now that is as old as America. We've seen this movie before, and it usually ends well. But there are some huge bumps on the road to a happy ending. And right now, we have landed in one of those potholes, and we're struggling to get out of it.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. So Doris, in your former capacity, you obviously must have encountered limitations to what can be accomplished without congressional action, which is kind of our current situation. Is there something beyond the changes that President Biden has implemented recently that can have a meaningful impact on the flow of immigration and also a flow of migrants and the adjudication of their cases without congressional action?
Well, congressional action is the MIA here. I mean, Congress if we just start with basic civics, we have three branches of government: executive, legislative, judicial, and it's the legislative that has been missing in action for decades. So we have laws that are entirely out of date, are not suited to our current reality. And the best example of that is we do not have a way for people to access U.S. immigration for work purposes unless you have a family member in the United States, basically, or unless you're a highly skilled worker. And yet we have labor market needs across the across the job spectrum. And immigration, to a great extent, fills a lot of those jobs, but in entirely the wrong way. people coming into the country unauthorized, people being hired, in violation of the laws by employers, et cetera, et cetera. So the congressional part of this is huge, but as you say, it's not happening. There's a paralysis, and that could continue. So when it comes to the executive branch, let me pick up on what Bill said about we're in a pothole and we're struggling. I mean, that is very much the an image in terms of where the administration is. And there's one, and yet the administration has used its executive branch authorities in ways that we have never seen before, absolutely to the hilt, and to the point that there is litigation questioning the degree to which the administration is overusing or misusing its authorities. I mentioned before the parole authority. Parole is an element of U.S. immigration law that allows the executive branch to exercise discretion to permit people to come into the country, typically for humanitarian reasons of one sort or another. The parole authority has always been, Congress as an institution has always been skeptical about the administration's use of any executive branch use of the parole authority. Executive branches have, over the years, for decades, used the parole authority because of how dynamic immigration is as an issue and simply having to do things. But that use of parole authority is now gone to levels that we've never seen before. I mean, there are literally hundreds of thousands, well, actually counting toward millions of people that will have come into the country in recent years that are in this parole status. And the difficulty with the parole status is that it's a liminal state. It's a status that from which you cannot adjust to getting a green card or to citizenship without Congress acting. And so many, many people now in this parole authority, some of them likely will be renewed for years at a time, is a very, very difficult situation in terms of immigrant integration, just the functioning of the system overall. And yet the administration has been able to cope to some considerable extent with trying to create some more orderly processes. As I described, I mean, these special programs that are parole programs have succeeded in redirecting the flows in ways that does make it more manageable for the current resources that the executive branch has to manage the system. But the really most important, I think, example of that is quite recent, and I don't think it's getting nearly the attention that it deserves. And it is this. It is foreign policy and working with the countries in the region. Because we have now, in this current year, beginning in January 2024, the administration has succeeded in bringing the numbers of apprehensions at the southwest border dramatically down. 70% reduction in the numbers of people crossing the southwest border illegally between the ports of entry from the prior years, and particularly 2023, which was the highest number of apprehensions that we've had. And they have done that by these approaches that are heavily, heavily criticized by human rights groups, by international monitors, et cetera, but by basically saying you cannot apply for asylum if you get to the US border between a port of entry. We've given you ways to apply. We've given you the CBP One app as a way to apply. We've given you the special programs for certain countries. We've created these regional mobility offices. But if you come between a port of entry without having tried to use those more orderly ways of coming, which are at numbers that we can manage, we will not accept your asylum claim. Now, there are some exceptions, there always are some exceptions, but basically that has been a very, very harsh and definitive change on the part of the administration. But what that is also being combined with that is very much less understood is the role that Mexico is playing. Because Mexico at this point, and a whole set of actions that Mexico has put into place, is the the deeper underlying reasons that these numbers are coming down. I mean, the fiscal year ends at the end of, in a couple of weeks at the end of September. We are going to see at the end of September lower numbers of crossing at the southwest border since before illegal crossings, since before Biden took office. That is an extraordinary change. But to a great extent, that is because Mexico, through diplomacy and through a whole set of very, very intense efforts on the part of the US and Mexico, have developed a set of initiatives and cooperation that is leading Mexico to do a massive amount of enforcement within Mexico as a transit country on the nationalities of people that are using Mexico to get to the United States. And so I do think that in the future, we are going to see much more the foreign policy side of this. I mean, this will depend, of course, on how the presidential election turns out. But the foreign policy tool is an extremely important one, and it is now being seen in agreements, something called the LA Declaration, etc. And it is also pointing toward the one most difficult foreign policy situation probably that we have, which is Venezuela. And Venezuela is in fact largely the reason that so much of this migration in recent years has become so explosive. For a while, the hope that Maduro might be defeated was kind of holding Venezuela stable over the last, say, 6 months or so. It's looking less and less like, it's looking more and more like Maduro is surviving. And if he does survive, that's going to create another issue, most likely with Venezuelans. And those are things that migration policy cannot fix. These are foreign policy issues that require bigger approaches. And I think those are the kinds of approaches that we really have to be looking to in the future in order to succeed, because this is now a global phenomenon, and leaving it to the executive branch has used and overused virtually every tool at its disposal.
Thank you, Doris. I really appreciate that. I want to remind our audience that we'd love to have your questions. You can submit them via X at Brookings.gov, Brookings.gov with the hashtag immigration policy, or you can email us at events@brookings.edu. Elaine, I'm going to turn back to you. Wanted to get your thoughts on how, based on what we know at the moment, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have different approaches to immigration policy at our southern border. Wanted you to be able to tell us what the differences are.
Okay. First of all, just let me say in general that this has not been a campaign heavy policy. Okay. Except you get to immigration and oh my God, there's a lot of policy being discussed. So let me start with Kamala Harris. Obviously, she has referred to Trump's killing the bipartisan immigration bill many times. She referred to it in her convention speech. She talks about it on the road. And she also recounts many of its measures to show, in part, that she's not soft on immigration, because Democrats are starting behind when it comes to that issue. The public does not trust the Democrats to deal with this issue, at least in the way they'd like it to be dealt with. She has to stand by the provisions of this bill. Depending what happens in the Congress, she has to try and get it passed. If she can't get it passed, she needs to keep working on perhaps breaking it up, or I don't know what strategy might work the best. But basically, if you want to know Harris's position on immigration, I think if you look at the bipartisan bill, you'll pretty much have it. Going to Trump, it's much more complicated. This is his number one issue. It even eclipses the economy from time to time in the passion of his rhetoric. in early 2024, when the crossings had been so high, immigration ranked ahead of the economy in Gallup's they asked voters about the most important issue. And by the summer, it remains among the top 3 issues. From the time Trump has announced the first time, he has demonized immigrants, calling them criminals, rapists, mentally ill, saying that immigrants from Venezuela were not human. And his rhetoric continues to be incendiary. Just a few days ago, he said, quote, "I will ban refugee settlements from terror-infested areas like the Gaza Strip. We will seal our border and bring back the travel ban." Remember the famous travel ban? We don't take people from certain areas of the world. So Trump carried this anti-immigration rhetoric right into the White House. And of course, as you may remember, the very first thing he did was try to enact a ban on immigration from certain Muslim countries. Now, it didn't work. It took 3 tries, and it took some amendments in order to get it to pass muster at the U.S. Supreme Court. But Trump has promised to go back to the ban. And in fact, he has made this one of his day one promises. He has made more day one promises on immigration than any other issue. One of them, so let me just talk about a couple of them. First is he promises the largest deportation operation in American history. He hasn't provided many details on how he would do that. And of course, there are many legal questions. But some of his compatriots have suggested that he invoke the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 that allows the U.S. to deport any non-citizen from a country the U.S. is at war with. This, it is argued, could sidestep a law that bans the military from civilian law enforcement, posse comitatus. He and his buddy, the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, have talked about the immigration problem at the border as an invasion. So they've sort of shifted the legal framing of this, and they've talked about using National Guard troops and going actually into other states to arrest people and deport them, like Texas National Guard going into Maryland and arresting people. Now, this could get pretty wild, but this is the discussion. Trump has also vowed to close the southern border. It's not clear how that would happen. As Doris mentioned, our ports of entry see a huge amount of commerce every single day. I don't know how that would happen. But he also plans to terminate every open border policy of the Biden administration, such as the parole authority, which has recently allowed Venezuelans and Haitians into the country. He's attacked birthright citizenship, which as I'm sure you know, means that if you're born in the United States, you're an American citizen. It's as old as the nation itself. It's in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So this would probably require a constitutional amendment. He wants to end automatic citizenship for the children of illegal immigrants, restore the Muslim ban. And then in Project 2025, which has been much discussed and disavowed by Trump, the section on the Department of Homeland Security was written by Ken Cuccinelli, who was Trump's own deputy secretary at DHS. Some of those highlights are they take on the H-2 visas, the H-2A and H-2B visas, the agricultural and the seasonal non-agricultural. They want to make sure that those visa numbers don't rise above the statutory cap. They want to make sure that no other countries are added to the countries that we could issue H-2 visas to. And so there's a lot of concentration on that program. And then there's a big combination of a lot of immigration and border related agencies because they would like to abolish DHS. And, it was sort of amusing to me because I testified on the creation of DHS. And of course, DHS was created to combine all these agencies under one roof. So I don't quite understand how that would work. But in other words, there's a lot of thinking and a lot of policy proposals on the Republican side about the border and about how we, act at the border and what we should do at the border. It's a very rich stew. And I suspect if Trump were to be elected, be a lot of lawsuits, a lot of fights in Congress, a lot of veto threats or whatever, and we'd have quite a show. But just the sheer volume of policy, I knew it was a big issue for him, but I was surprised at just the sheer volume of policy that they are putting out on this issue. In contrast to, say, healthcare, where Trump has famously said he has a concept for healthcare, but no plan. So, the contrast here is pretty dramatic.
Thanks very much for that, Elaine. That's a pretty fulsome accounting of the different approaches to immigration. So Doris, I want to turn to you for just a brief answer on this. So obviously the policy proposals put forth by President Trump and Vice President Harris are very different. They also involve a number of complexities. Based on what we've seen here, what Elaine has outlined, what do you think are the possibilities for how feasible are these policies? Given what you know, your own experiences, how feasible are these policies?
Well, they all go to the issue of resources, and that ultimately is congressional. Even though we can't get substantive legislation out of Congress, we also haven't been able to get appropriations. And when Elaine talked about the border bill, she talked about the second half of it from the standpoint of resources, the huge impact that those kinds of resource allocations would make really do constitute the policy, because that is so much of what is making it difficult to enforce border policies with these new flows. So I think that I think Trump would have a much more difficult time than a Harris would. I mean, Harris would continue most likely most of the Biden policies, but Trump is talking about, in the case of mass deportations in particular, kinds of efforts that there are not resources for it. And as a result, you have to really recognize that the upshot is chaos and a climate of fear. And those are policies in and of themselves, which we've seen before.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Doris. Bill, you gave us a kind of a thumbnail sketch, Cliff Notes version of immigration, the history of immigration in the U.S. You moved from kind of early days to the 1920s to the 2000s. So you kind of skipped over a lot, but the point is clear. We are a nation of immigrants. We've always had to deal with that inflow. Sometimes we've done it well. Sometimes we have hit a few speed bumps and maybe we're in potholes. We seem to be in one right now. Do you think there's a political path forward for reform on immigration?
Well, to answer your question, Camille, let me just go back to a point that both Doris and Elaine made in different ways. And that is that executive authority has reached its limit, perhaps has exceeded its limit. There is no way to make progress on this problem without a Congress that is functionally capable of coming to grips with it. Unfortunately, that runs smack up against a basic reality of American politics today. We are deeply polarized, and that polarization has negatively affected the Congress much more than either the judiciary or the executive branch. So right now, we have on immigration and many other issues a kind of a ping pong match between the executive and the judiciary, with Congress sitting paralyzed on the sidelines. So yes, I think eventually we will make progress on this issue. Winston Churchill famously said of the United States that it will do the right thing only after it has exhausted all of the alternatives. And I think we have come pretty close to exhausting all of the bad alternatives. And I think there is hope, for example, that if there were a Harris administration, that in some way, shape, or form, some of the building blocks of the compromise bill that Harris's opponent, former President Trump, undermined, could be restored and could gain enough bipartisan support. There could, of course, be a filibuster in Congress. I also want to underscore another point that Doris made, which I think is absolutely essential. Not only do we need a new enforcement regime, we also need a dramatic updating of the basic framework of our immigration law, which has been frozen now for decades, even as the needs of the country have been transformed out of all recognition. I have my own views on that subject. For example, that we put too much stress on family reunification in our immigration policy and too little on the economic requirements of the country. Our neighbor to the north, Canada, made that transition a couple of decades ago, and it has not only benefited Canada tremendously, but has muted a previously raging debate in Canada about the levels of immigration. We could reap the same benefits, but we're going to need, in order to make any of this possible, a president who can genuinely work with both sides in Congress to marginalize the extremists and to try to put together the center left and the center right into a winning supermajority coalition. We almost got there in 2013. And I don't rule out the possibility that we could get there again. Let me just make one other comment. And that is that looming over this entire discussion is a venerable piece of legislation called the Insurrection Act, which has gotten to be sort of my hobby horse, because it gives so much power to the president to use the military, U.S. military, in circumstances that the president deems appropriate, without much opportunity for either congressional say-so or judicial review. The Insurrection Act could be invoked to implement a substantial portion of the mass deportation scheme that former President Trump and his advisors have floated. And that might give him an entering wedge for using portions of the Department of Defense budget in order to sustain an otherwise unsustainable operation. As Elaine said, that would create a genuinely explosive domestic situation. But in the past, Mr. Trump has been willing to create explosive situations in pursuit of his major objectives. And there's no reason to believe that he wouldn't be willing to do so again. So that is not just a fantasy proposal. That's a real possibility. And I think we should all reflect on that.
Well, thank you, Bill, for those comments and reflections. One of our audience has asked about foreign policy. Doris, you alluded to the fact that some of the levers here are really foreign policy levers when we're talking about working with Mexico, and I'm assuming other kinds of other states as well. The question here is whether the lack of diplomatic relations with certain countries has actually tended to increase the level of kind of between the ports of call, reports of entry, immigration. So the question is not so much about the positive use of foreign policy to affect immigration, but whether just the lack of diplomatic relations and therefore foreign policy approaches in some countries has contributed to the crisis prior to the most recent set of reforms by the Biden administration.
Yes, it has, because you have to have diplomatic relations with a country in order to return people to that country. Now, it's also the case that the countries with which we don't have diplomatic relations, in this case, Cuba, Haiti, and Venezuela, are countries that are repressive and that do have people that are likely legitimate asylum seekers or legitimate refugees. But again, because of the difficulties in those societies, there are also very harsh living circumstances. And so people fleeing those countries, if they do get to the United States, and we determine that they're not eligible to enter, we can't return them because the countries don't receive them back. This is one of the reasons why it has been so exceptional to see the relationship with Mexico develop the way that it has, because Mexico has allowed us to return non-Mexicans, i.e. Cubans, Haitians, and Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans to Mexico, since they actually can return to those countries, although they don't really have the capacity to do so. However, returning people at least to Mexico does make some difference, but at the end of the day, it's a big problem when countries won't accept the return of their nationals.
Great, thank you very much, Doris. We have just a few more minutes, and Elaine, I'm going to have you take us home on this question. So obviously, it would be immensely helpful to have Congress willing to roll up their sleeves and do some work on this. And we've had, several parts of our discussion have really focused on the role of Congress and its importance to this issue. I want you to project a little bit. So, we obviously have an election coming up. We're not going to talk about the presidential candidates, but looking at Congress, can we expect if we have Republicans taking the Senate, and either Republicans or Democrats in charge of the House? What can we expect in terms of willingness to work on this issue at the congressional level?
Well, that's a tricky question. Clearly, when the Senate entered the negotiation between the Republicans and Democrats on this question, it was clearly an indication that some of the most hardline senators who worked on that were actually willing to stand behind the bill. In fact, it was sort of being remarked upon as a miracle in Washington until Trump decided that he did not want his Republican senators to do this because he wanted to retain immigration as an issue. Now, the bill is very carefully balanced. There's just goodies in it for everybody, as always happens in a compromise bill. So you can see, without presidential interference, you can see a lot of people deciding to sign on to this bill. Because you can see that that a lot of Republicans would like making it tougher to get into the country, tougher to apply for asylum. You'd see a lot of the Democrats would like the aid to the cities that are overwhelmed with refugees and need help. They need financial help, etc. You can see there's sweeteners in it for everybody. And as I think Bill and Doris have pointed out, we have an antique architecture for our whole immigration system anyway. So, we need to fix that up. So I think it's actually a bill that, barring outside influence, Congress could pass, even a Republican Congress, because even if they take the Senate, they're not going to have 60 votes. They won't be able to stop legislation. So even a Republican Senate and a Democratic House, I think, could probably pass something. But again, it goes back to who the president was. The other option that always happens with these great big bills is that you chunk them out. You know what I mean? You put a little piece of it here on an appropriates bill, you put a little piece of it here, and you gradually get what you want to do. And you could see that happening too, particularly if the temperature on the issue was turned down. And there's a basic rule of American politics, which is if the public is really, really, really engaged in something and the temperature is really high, it makes it very hard for people to compromise. If the issue is kind of, on the back burner for a while and, with numbers at the border going down, that might happen, then maybe you could see a little bit of progress. So I would say cautiously optimistic.
Great. Thanks very much, Elaine. Really appreciate that. Doris, Bill, and Elaine, thank you very much for sharing your analysis on this event. Thank you to the audience for joining us. And we are done with this event. Join us at brookings.edu if you want to see it again, or if you want to view other content on immigration. Thank you.